once again, Internet. My name is Nicole, and this is my fiancé Ivan, and today we are going to talk about our favorite books from 2015.
Hi.
So we both made our list of favorite books for the year. I have 11, actually I have 12 books on my list, although two of them are by the same author, so I'm going to talk about them together. And Ivan has
6 or 7, maybe.
Fewer than me, but that's okay. And so we will tell you about our favorites, and yeah, let's start doing that. So the first two items on my list are both graphic novels. The first one here is Nimona by Novellas Stevenson. This is a fantasy young adult graphic novel about a young girl named Nimona who decides to become the sidekick to an evil supervillain who is Ballister Blackwater, who's this guy. And they are plotting to take down the good people, and it's really entertaining and kind of heartwarming at the same time, and I just really enjoyed this graphic novel.
Alright, the first book that I wanted to bring up is 15 Lives of Harry August. It's an excellent book. It's a science fiction work with the premise that certain people can live their life over and over and over again and remember it each time. And can kind of interact with events past and present and future through, influencing things during their timeline. And there's a whole society of these people, and they begin to, by sort of going through the book, to face a really serious threat, and the main character is a great character. It's beautifully written. The other characters are also great in some of these interactions, especially with the main character and his kind of rival, are excellent. Overall, it's a great premise, it's well written, and it's a fun read.
And I read that book back in 2014, I think. I read it the year it came out, which I think was 2014, and I really liked it too. And I listened to the audiobook, and the narrator was really good. My second book on this list is another graphic novel or graphic memoir, and this is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is like a really classic book in the kind of graphic things field. It was the book that really popularized like graphic memoir as a medium. It's about Art Spiegelman and his father was a Jew living in Poland when the Nazis invaded, and he survived that, obviously. And so it's about both his father's time in the concentration camp and during World War II, and also about their relationship when they're older, and Art Spiegelman as an adult. And I really enjoyed it. I think both the parts which are about the life of a Jew living in Nazi Germany, and also the parts discussing, father and son relationships that can be really difficult. I thought both of those were done really well, and overall I just really enjoyed the graphic novel.
The book I wanted to mention, and these are in no particular order, is The Shepherd's Crown, which is the final book, as far as I know, written and published by Terry Pratchett before his death. Books in his very famous Discworld series, and I think it is an excellent book to end that series on. It deals with a wonderful character who's a young witch, and there's been a couple of books written about her before that one, and this sort of concludes her story, and in part kind of concludes the Discworld story, and I wish there were more, but that's the end, and it's an excellent book and an end to an excellent series, and I thought it was worth mentioning.
So another book this year that I really enjoyed, which I actually just finished towards the end of the year here, was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book in a high fantasy series set in a world where there are magicians who can control the earth. And so this world is very tectonically active, and so there are a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes and things of that nature. And so these magicians, their power is really useful because it can quell the earthquakes and the volcanoes and everything, but it can also cause them. So they're very tightly controlled, and the book starts with the end of the world with like a massive volcanic event, and we're following characters as they deal with that and deal with magical abilities and things, and I just thought it was a really excellent start to a new series.
Next book that I wanted to bring up was The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. I discovered this author at the book fair that I attended at USC.
LA Times Festival of Books.
Yes, LA Times Festival of Books, and I actually was in one of the panels where I heard him talk, and his book sounded really interesting, so I went ahead and picked it up, and I wasn't disappointed. It's an excellent book. It's basically a fantasy a sort of a low magic setting fantasy retelling of, I suppose it's pretty similar to Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's based on an ancient Chinese epic, and it's kind of a fantasy retelling with a new twist, and it's an excellent book. It deals a lot with politics, but also from the eyes of very interesting characters. Deals a lot with warfare, but not really all that action heavy. I think character driven, sort of story driven tale that I think may be reminiscent a little bit of maybe some of George R.R. Martin's work, except definitely not as dark or grim as Martin gets. I think overall more of a, I wouldn't call his book lighthearted, but definitely more of a hopeful tone, more of a placid tone set by this work. I thought it was very well written, interesting, great characters, and I would definitely recommend this book.
I also read this right at the end of the year while we were on vacation. I actually got an e-copy of it, and I really enjoyed it as well. And I got it signed when we were at the book festival, so that's cool.
Was it?
Yeah, the next book that I wanted to talk about is The City and the City by China Miéville. This is a crazy sort of science fiction, fantasy, mystery type book. There's a lot of elements kind of worked in together. It's very fast-paced and really an interesting mystery, and the basic concept is that there are these two cities, and they're adjacent to each other, and a murder happens in one city, and it turns out that the body was dumped from the other city, and so we're following a police officer as he tries to navigate the weird bureaucratic system these cities have for dealing with each other, because they're kind of on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain.
It's actually really kind of a fascinating concept, because they exist in the same place, so like one block may belong to one city, and right across the street it may be like another block belonging to a different city, and it's literally against the law from people from one city to interact with another city, to the point that people have sort of psychologically trained themselves to not notice or pay attention to anything that happens in the other city. Really cool concept that is really confusing at first, but by the time the book kind of picks up and gets on, and it gets explained more, you see you're like, wow, that's really interesting.
Yes. So as you can tell, I haven't also read this book this year and really liked it. We read it for one of our book clubs, or at least I read it for one of our book clubs. Did you come to that book club?
No, I think I read it later.
Okay. But it's a really good book. You should check it out.
Other books I read this year, and I know it's a little bit of an older book. In fact, Nicole might have talked about it in one of the previous years. The Goblin Emperor. Did you?
I read that last year. Yes.
It's fantasy. It's pretty straightforward, kind of a political intrigue plot, but it's fun, interesting. You really get to feel for the main character, and sort of, he's a young, half goblin, least favorite child. Basically, is the last heir to the throne, so they bring him over, and they're like, congratulations, you're emperor now, and kind of have him navigate that treacherous political landscape where pretty much everybody wants to kill him or marry him off to someone. So it's not particularly deep, but I think it's an interesting story, and it's a fun read, so I like it.
Yes, and that made it into my favorites of last year. So. The next book that I wanted to mention is actually a novella, and this is The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. This novella is set in a world where there's a magic system, because Brandon Sanderson, there's a magic system. Ivan is not really into the whole magic system.
I'm not really into the whole, Brandon Sanderson thing. I think he's okay.
But so anyway, getting back to The Emperor's Soul, so there is a magic system where you can imprint, you can create a stamp and imprint materials to change or to do something the way that to behave in a certain way. And so our main character is a magician of this type, and she's I believe she stole something in the beginning of this, and she is currently in prison, and she's in a prison that's specifically designed for people like her. And in order to get out, she gets a proposition from some of the people in the royal court to do a particular job, and it's about her trying to do that and navigate kind of their world. And it was really cool. It was a really cool novella, and I really liked it. And you should read it. It's pretty short. I think it's under 100 pages. Just go read it.
I want to give a shout out to an author next. This is Robert Jackson Bennett, and I read 3 books from him this year, all of which were good. One of which I thought was great, which is called The Troupe. It's sort of a kind of a traveling circus sort of book. If you ever read something like The Night Circus, it's a little reminiscent of that, or Johannes Cabal, the Necromancer, kind of reminiscent of that. It's about basically a group of essentially magicians traveling in a circus, but there's a deeper meaning to their travels, and they're looking for something, and it's sort of a mystery plot, and then there's a threat to the world, and I just found it a great story that I thought was well written. City of Stairs is a fantasy novel with some wonderful world building and an interesting concept, and American Elsewhere is a sort of a sci-fi sort of gothic sci-fi, can you even say that? Sort of sci-fi story set in a small town, sort of in the middle of nowhere in America, and provides some interesting characters, interesting science fiction concept. So just kind of all those 3 together made it into a top book for me this year.
And I read 2 of those this year. I read City of Stairs and The Troupe. I liked City of Stairs better, and there's a sequel coming out to that, which we'll probably both read.
Isn't it out already? I feel like it's out already.
I think it comes out in February. The book that was one of my favorites this year was The Magician's Land by Lev Grossman. This is the 3rd book in his Magician's trilogy, and I really liked it. I read the entire trilogy this year, and I think the last book was my favorite, and I thought it wrapped up the series really well. So the basic premise of the series is that we have a young man named Quentin Coldwater, who in the first book finds out that magic is real, and he goes to basically a college for magicians, except Quentin and his friends are all, like, terrible people, at least in the beginning, and I found them really entertaining.
They're
to
normal people.
watch. They're kind of terrible people.
They're pretty normal.
They're pretty terrible. And I'm gonna obviously also read these. And there's a TV series coming out, which I will probably be watching. Yep.
Interesting. I've read these books, I think, read The Magicians when it first came out a long time, like 7 years ago or so.
5 years ago?
I think it was longer.
Okay.
It was the first year of med school. But it was good, and I kept reading, and I enjoyed the entire series. I'm hard-pressed to say which book is my favorite, actually. I'd probably say it's the 2nd, because it has the most interesting character story, kind of,
Julia?
in it. Yeah.
Yes, Julia's story in the 2nd book is really cool.
Yeah, so, but I definitely recommend to read. It's a more sort of serious-minded fantasy dealing with issues of growing up, kind of transitioning from real life, transitioning from this period of excitement of, like, I don't know, I guess in the book it's more like, it's kind of like, oh my god, college, to, hey, this is kind of my life now and my job, and sort of the struggle to make something better of yourself, but then sort of the challenges that the characters face, both sort of within from various fantastical adversaries and just from their own kind of personalities and conflicts between these people and these friends.
But I'm going to carry on with the magical schools theme, because apparently I like magical schools a lot, and I also like making fun of magical schools, and talk about a book that I recently read, which is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This book is actually, it's my first Rainbow Rowell book, but it's kind of like a companion to a different book, and so this is set in a universe where Simon Snow is the main character, and he's kind of like a Harry Potter type character, where he's a boy at a magic school and he's a chosen one and all of that fun stuff. And it's about him and how it's a more realistic portrayal of a chosen one story, I think. And I just thought it was really funny and entertaining and cute, and I really enjoyed this one.
Next book I want to talk about is called Flex. I forget the author at the moment. It's an urban fantasy book, and no year should be complete without a good urban fantasy book, because that is probably my at least most read genre, not necessarily my favorite. It's a book set in the modern world where sort of an alternate history where there are magicians or wizards who live among people, and their magical talent is to bend the universe in line with their own obsessions. So you can have like a cat ladymancer who has thousands of cats somehow inside of her house, or a video game mancer who's obsessed with playing video games and can make video games out of real life. And it's an interesting magic system, but more than that, it's a well-written book with a main character who actually starts out as a police officer who's trying to who encountered sort of one of these rogue wizards and was wounded by them and became an insurance agent with the goals of hunting them down, but he actually also himself becomes able to use magic through the power of bureaucracy. And he's basically, since magic is completely illegal in this world, he's trying to sort of hunt down a really scary magician while he himself tries to avoid being detected and basically having his mind wiped. So it's interesting. It's got interesting characters and interesting relationships, and I'd definitely recommend a read if you're interested in urban fantasy at all.
And it's a duology, right?
There are 2 books in the series, and I don't know if there's plans for any more. Together they wrap up the story pretty nicely.
I'm now going to get into some of my favorite books that were not science fiction and fantasy. So the first for this, I also have an author who I discovered I really like this year, and that is Mary Roach. Mary Roach writes sort of humorous science nonfiction books, and the 2 of hers that were my favorite that I read this year, I read all 5 of the books that she's published so far, but the 2 that were my favorite were Packing for Mars, which is about space, and Stiff, which is about cadavers and dead bodies and things. And I just really enjoy Mary Roach's writing style, and I think she picks some really fascinating topics, and I just overall really like her, and especially those 2, and especially Packing for Mars, because I really like space, so I thought that book was really cool.
Last final mention, a book that I picked up before going on vacation right before the end of the year, and that I really enjoyed. It's called 3 Parts Dead, a fantasy book sort of set in a world where there are gods, and then people kind of figured out that they could use some of the same powers that gods use to become magicians, and in the past there was this war between these newly minted magicians and gods who exist sort of ruling their own little kingdoms on this planet. And the main story happens many decades after that, and I've read 3 of the books so far, and they all in a way deal with the aftermath and the implications for this changing world and changing balance of power and dynamic. Supporters of some of them are suffering, while others kind of are profiting at others' expense, and there's a lot of mystery in these books. There's a lot of politics in these books. There's a lot of exploring this world and the social structures of this world in these books, and I think this starts a great series, and definitely at least check out or think about checking out the first part, which is 3 Parts Dead.
Next book I wanted to talk about is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This book has gotten a lot of buzz all over the internet, so I won't talk about it too much, but I really enjoyed this book. This is a contemporary book, and it's about a group of friends living in New York, and it's kind of about their lives after they graduate college, kind of until the end of their lives. And we're following 4 friends, but we're really following our main character, Jude, who is the survivor of some pretty terrible child abuse. And it's kind of about how that just influences his life and the life of everyone around him. And it's just a really wonderfully written book, and it is super sad. So if you want a super sad book, you should read this one. And my last 2 books on the list are both kind of classics. The first one is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This was a reread for me. I had read this for the first time in high school, and I reread it, and I was pretty pleased to see that it held up really well to rereading as an adult, which is not something that's always happened to me with books that I read for the first time in high school. And the final book that was one of my favorites of 2015 was The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is another classic, and this was the first time I had read this book. It is about a poor black woman living in the South and kind of her life, and it's told in an epistolary format where in the beginning she is writing letters to God, and then later she's writing letters to other people, and so it's her narrating her own life and her own thoughts. And I thought it was a really wonderful book, and it was also really sad, but then really happy sometimes too, and I just thought it was really moving and a great read. Those are all of our favorite books from 2015. Say goodbye to Ivan. Maybe he'll be back in another. Maybe he'll be back in another video.
See you next year.
All right. Have a good one. Bye bye.